What are the best low-level skill feats in Pathfinder 2e? Which ones are they? And if you pick the wrong skill feat, will you be skillfully disappointed like I am in literally every aspect of my life? I freaking hope not. This is the Dominomicon, authored and hosted by me, Dominic. The Dominomicon is dedicated to all nerdy things, with my current obsession being the TTRPG Pathfinder 2nd Edition. In this video chapter, I'm going to go over what I believe are the top 10 low-level skill feats. I'll first go over what skills and skill feats are all about, and then we'll jump into the list where I'll mention prerequisites, etc. And bear in mind that these skill feats are level 1 and are common in rarity. I've done my best to vary the sorts of skills that the skill feats are associated with, but ultimately some skill feats are just too darned good not to include, even if I've already mentioned one from that particular skill. If you find this video chapter helpful or enjoyable, please clickety-click or tappity-tap the like button and consider subscribing. Without any more faff though, let's jump in. Insert music here. So this is a top 10 list and there are 16 skills in PF2E. This means that some skills are basically not going to be mentioned at all in this list, and I'll flash these on screen for you now. Viewers no doubt know what skills and skill feats are all about, but for a quick explanation, you're able to increase your proficiency in your skills depending on your class and your intelligence modifier at level 1. And as you level up, you get to increase these further. Proficiency in PF2E works rather simply. You can be trained, expert, master, or legendary, and that comes with a +2, +4, +6, and then +8 to that particular skill. And it also adds on your attribute modifier to that number and your level. And of course, the higher the number, the better you are at the skill. Simple. And you can increase your skill proficiency every odd level, and you gain a skill feat every even level, though some classes, such as the rogue, alter this. And when you get a general feat, you can choose to take a skill feat instead. Now, before we jump into the list proper, I do want to mention the skill feats Dubious Knowledge and Assurance. Both of these can be taken as part of any skill, and I actually highly recommend both of them. Dubious Knowledge means that even if you fail a recall knowledge action but not critically fail, you'll still gain a correct piece of information. You will also gain an incorrect piece of information, and you'll not necessarily know which is which can be kind of hilarious and fun at the same time, especially for your GM. I did this for one of my players the other day when they were attempting to figure out what these fey creatures were inside this tower, and he used Dubious Knowledge and failed, and thus I told him that these creatures were draconic, and it's surprising that they were even able to fit in the tower. And he roleplayed his character as being too terrified to go into the tower for fear of it collapsing on top of him due to their large size, which was brilliant. Suffice to say, it's just still a fantastic skill feat to pick up when you can, just because you can gain actual useful information, even on a fail. Assurance, on the other hand, again, can be applied to any skill, and you need to pick the skill when you grab the skill feat. Instead of rolling, you can then just add 10 to your proficiency bonus, though bear in mind this doesn't include any of the bonuses, penalties, or modifiers, which includes your attribute bonus, and that's kind of important. But it does ignore the multiple attack penalty, so that's also kind of important. Realistically, if you take Assurance in a particular skill, you're going to want to max out your proficiency in that skill whenever possible to actually make Assurance worth taking. As ever in PF2E, combining abilities works rather well. So if you combine your Dubious Knowledge with a Recall Knowledge check on an enemy to find out whether or not your Assurance is actually going to work with your particular skill you want to do, such as using Athletics to trip them or using Deception to deceive them, etc., then you'll know whether or not you're actually going to potentially waste an action using said Assurance. As I always say, combining abilities in PF2E is how you win. I don't actually always say that, but I'm saying it now. With those two skill feats out of the way, let's jump into the list proper, starting with number 1, Intimidating Glare, which requires that you're trained in Intimidation. This skill feat is rather simple, but it really does give your Demoralize action a bit of a boost. I've already mentioned Demoralize in one of my previous videos, which I'll link to in the description. Go and watch it now if you haven't already, I love you. So I'm not going to go back over it right now, but suffice to say, it's one of the most powerful skill actions in the entire system. The downside to Demoralize is that if the creature you're attempting to scare does not share a language with you, you take a -4 circumstance penalty to that intimidation check. And a -4 penalty in PF2E is basically the same as just being dead, with your entire ancestral line and family name wiped from the history books. Okay, maybe it's not that bad, but it's still really bad. Intimidating Glare basically just removes that penalty, so you're actually able to make those Demoralize actions count for a lot more. To top that off, the actual Demoralize attempt loses the auditory trait, meaning that you can scare people by simply looking at them. Maybe you're super ugly or something, I don't know. I would actually say that Intimidating Glare is essential to any characters that want to be able to use Intimidation as one of their somewhat regular actions in combat. And that's Intimidating Glare, nice and simple. Let's jump on to number 2, Battle Medicine, which requires training in medicine. I'm pretty sure I've mentioned Battle Medicine multiple times before, but it is absolutely fantastic. Being able to heal someone for one action in combat without any magic is not a thing that can be understated. stated. And as I've mentioned in a previous video chapter, you can use this to heal yourself, so long as you have a free hand and healer's tools on you. And if you happen to get a critical success, which is not that particularly challenging, then you'll be healing yourself for a pretty significant amount. A battle medicine also basically makes practically anyone able to be an emergency healer. So if you're in one of those groups that only has one designated healer, I'd highly recommend someone else grab some training in medicine so you can nab battle medicine. So if your healer goes down, you can heal them immediately. There's very few things scarier in combat than your one designated healer being knocked unconscious with no way for anyone to be able to get them back up. And battle medicine effectively fixes this for you. Alright, skill feat number 3, Titan Wrestler, which requires training in athletics. This one is kind of similar to Intimidating Glare in that it basically removes a sort of restriction or penalty that you would take for attempting certain actions depending on certain circumstances. Normally, when you're attempting to disarm, grapple, or reposition, shove, or trip a creature that is more than one size larger than you, you cannot. Titan Wrestler removes that restriction and allows you to use these actions on creatures that are up to 2 sizes larger than you. And this means that if you're normal size, you can now trip and grapple etc. creatures that are huge, and if you're small, you're now able to do it on creatures that are large, and if you're tiny, you can do it on creatures that are medium, which is kind of ridiculous because that's like a cat grappling and pile driving you. The trip thing makes sense because I'm almost always tripping over my cat Molly. I'm pretty sure she does it deliberately, honestly. But yes, Titan Wrestler is another one of those feats that's effectively required if you want to use athletic maneuvers on creatures, as you're definitely going to come into contact with much bigger enemies, especially as your campaign progresses. So if your intention is to grapple, trip, shove, etc. enemies regularly, Titan Wrestler is there for you. Okay, next up is number 4, Catfall, which requires training in acrobatics. This one's relatively simple. You treat falls as though they are 10 feet shorter than they actually are. Normally in PF2E, when you fall more than 5 feet, you take bludgeoning damage equal to half the distance you fell. So if you fall 10 feet, you would take 5 damage, and if you fall 30 feet, you would take 15 bludgeoning damage, and so on. With Catfall, if you fall 10 feet, you take 0 damage, and that's nice, but what's better is that as your proficiency increases in acrobatics, so too does the distance that you can fall without taking damage. And once you get expert proficiency, which is not all that hard to do, you can ignore 25 foot drops entirely, which is rather high, honestly. And when you're master, this is 50 feet, and when you're legendary, you no longer take any damage at all from falling, which is kind of bonkers. While fall damage is not something that comes up all that often in PF2E, I guarantee that it will come up more than a few times in a campaign. So if you intend on running and jumping around like a lunatic, Catfall is absolutely essential for you. On to skill feat number 5, Bon Mot, which requires training in diplomacy. Bon Mot has craploads of traits for when you use it, so just bear that in mind. I have mentioned Bon Mot in one of my other videos, which again I'll link to in the description, and that's because it's pretty phenomenal. You choose a foe within 30 feet and roll a diplomacy check against their will DC. So long as you succeed or critically succeed, they take a penalty to the perception and will saves for an entire minute, which is quite powerful, especially for spellcasters. Genuinely, spellcasters are going to love you if you use this action on an enemy for them, as it's rather difficult to reduce will saves in PF2E without it. And something that could be very entertaining is that the person that you have Bon Mode is allowed to retort to your insult. And this is a fun little back and forth the GM can have with one of their players, throwing insults at each other throughout a fight. Could be great fun. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time going over this one because, as I've said, I've already mentioned it before, but Bon Mot is a fantastic skill feat if you have access to it, and I highly recommend you take it if you have any spellcasters in your group or you are yourself a spellcaster. So let's move on to number 6, Quick Repair, which requires training in crafting. Now this is another one of those skill feats which is relatively simple, but it has some pretty large benefits when you think about it. So when you take this skill feat, whenever you want to use the repair activity, you can do it as a 1-minute activity instead of 10 minutes. Now the thing about repair is that it doesn't have a cooldown, so if you have a damaged item such as a shield, which is probably going to be the case if you need to repair things super often, you would normally have to spend 10 minutes repairing it, and if you failed, that's 10 minutes wasted. And really, you're going to want to try and repair that item again, which is another 10 minutes gone. And depending on your GM, that time wasted could be a bit of a big deal. But Quick Repair turns this into a 1-minute activity, meaning that you can do this 10 times in the same span of time than you would have done one normal repair check with. And this potentially means that you could repair multiple items of yours and your party's incredibly quickly, as you get 10 tries effectively. And I know it's only repairing things, but it's still kind of mental to think that you could do 10 tries as opposed to 1 for just one skill feat. To top that off, as your skill in crafting goes up, so does the speed in which you can repair things. Once you're a master, it takes 3 actions, meaning you can do this in the middle of combat, and when you're legendary, it's 1 action, meaning you could potentially do 3 repair checks on your shield in the middle of a fight. And also bear in mind that the amount healed with a repair check goes up with your proficiency as well, so you're you're not only going to be able to do this faster, but you're also going to be able to repair things for more health. I think quick repair is a no-brainer for people who are shield users or even classes such as the Inventor, etc. For real, it's a really cool skill feat. Moving on to number 7, Natural Medicine, which requires training in nature. This skill feat has actually been improved in the remaster, so you can use nature instead of medicine to treat wounds. And if you have access to fresh ingredients, like if you're in a forest or something, you get a +2 circumstance bonus to that nature check. Just bear in mind that this doesn't work with anything like battle medicine, etc. It's very specifically for the treat wounds action, which battle medicine also sort of uses in its own certain way, so you cannot use them together. As I mentioned pre-remaster, this was kind of a bit of a trap option because it only really worked for trained medicine checks, and this meant that if you wanted to get better at treat wounds, you really needed to get better proficiency in medicine. But you don't need to do that now. Natural medicine allows you to do more difficult checks as your proficiency in nature goes higher. Realistically, this isn't going to be all that useful to someone that uses skill actions such as battle medicine regularly, but for characters that are maybe off healers that are already going to be increasing their nature skill anyway, such as druids or rangers, etc., it can be very, very powerful because you become an excellent out-of-combat healer for just one skill feat. As I said, if you're already increasing your proficiency in nature, this is just free healing with a potential +2 circumstance bonus, which is kind of mental anyway. Natural medicine is genuinely an excellent skill feat for anyone that's thinking of increasing their nature skill regardless. And next is number 8, Trick Magic Item, which requires training in Arcana, Nature, Occultism, or Religion. And this means that this is kind of a 4-for-1 on my list, so haha, screw you top 10 list. Trick Magic Item allows you to use a magical item you normally couldn't. Normally in PF2E, you cannot use a magical item that has a spell on it unless you can cast spells and have that particular spell on your traditions list. This is usually on items like scrolls, wands, or staffs, etc. Or is it staves? I hate that word. Why does it have to be pronounced so differently from staff? Why is English so upsetting? But with Trick Magic Item, so long as you have the required training in that particular spell list, so if you want to cast a primal spell, you need to be trained in nature, etc., then you're able to do a check and potentially cast a spell. The DC for the check is usually based on the item level, but if you succeed, then you can spend the normal amount of actions to activate this item as you normally would. This does mean that a 2-action spell effectively costs you 3 actions, but still, being able to cast something like a 2-action heal spell on yourself as a barbarian is kinda crazy. As for other spellcasters, this effectively gives you access to spells that normally wouldn't be on your list. Yes, they still have to be on a scroll, a staff, a wand, or whatever, but still, the point is you can effectively gain access to other traditions where you normally wouldn't. There are many very useful spells in PF2E, and having Trick Magic Items so you're able to activate them in a pinch is potentially phenomenal. I think this skill feat works just as well out of combat as it does in combat. Being able to make yourself go invisible or change your shape, etc. could be very useful in certain circumstances. Definitely consider adding this one to your list, especially non-spellcasters. Rolling on to number 9, Forager, which requires training in survival. A Forager is probably not going to be all that useful to most campaigns, but the way I run campaigns means that Forager is actually extraordinary. So if you're in a campaign that even has some light survival elements in it, I definitely give Forager a proper glance. Forager alters how the subsist exploration activity works. Normally, with subsist, you would roll a survival check, and if you succeed, you're able to feed yourself and find somewhere to rest. And if you critically succeed, you're able to do this for 2 people. But with Forager, if you roll anything worse than a success, it counts as a success anyway. On a success, you're able to provide food and shelter for yourself and 4 additional creatures, which is basically the entire party. On a critical success, that number is doubled. So if the whole party took Forager and got some critical successes, you could practically feed an entire village. Again, like I said, if your campaign doesn't have any survival elements in it whatsoever, this is not too useful, but otherwise, it's honestly a fantastic skill feat to grab if you're sick of failing those survival checks and having to manage rations, etc. Okay, last but not least, number 10, Read Lips, which requires training in society. I feel like this particular skill feat is one of those that's going to massively irritate your GM, which I'm sure will work out perfectly for you. Joking aside, it actually can be very useful in certain circumstances, but I think it's the roleplay potential for this skill feat that makes it so much fun. I don't know about other GMs, but in my games, whenever a player character sneaks off to have a private conversation, other PCs always want to listen into that conversation, and Read Lips is a great way to allow them to do this without having to do some annoying stealth checks, etc. So that's sort of the fun part of the roleplay side of this skill feat. And you can actually use this in combat as well, like if one of your adversaries is communicating with someone else, they're whispering to them or whatever, though bear in mind you are classed as fascinated during this action and you'll be off guard too. At that point you just make a society site to check and you can find out what it is that they're discussing. Still, I think overall this skill feat is probably better as a player-to-player roleplay tool for a bit of fun. This skill feat might not be the most useful on the list, but I wanted to include it because it could be potentially hilarious and not everything has to be 100% combat or mechanics related. We're allowed to have fun every now and then, right? Right. And so that's the end of my top 10 low-level skill feat list. Hopefully there's something in there for everyone, but in particular new players so they don't have as much trouble picking a good skill feat when they come up. If I missed anything there that you definitely think needs mentioning, please pop it down in the comments and I'll try my best to respond to each and every one of you as always. And if you found this video chapter helpful or enjoyable, please give it a like and consider subscribing. Your support means the world to me, genuinely. But that's it for this video chapter. This is Dominic of the Dominomicon wishing you a fond farewell, and until next time, goodbye.